Okay, great.
So we're going to follow up about that motion. So, but we'll talk some more sometime. Drop me an email.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to this discussion on this crucial and, I would say, radical topic. In our push for meaningful change on a global scale, which I imagine pretty much everyone who comes to this conference is interested in achieving, can a criminal law of ecocide play a role in a transition to agroecology? My name is Sarah Langford. I'm going to be moderating today's panel. I'm a writer and author of 2 memoirs, one about the law and one about regenerative farming. So I think you can probably see why I've got this is a cause that's very close to my heart. I manage a 250-acre organic farm in Suffolk. But before I did that, for 10 years, I was a criminal barrister. And I suppose I also have a personal interest in this. When I left the bar in 2014, and I was coming back to Chambers in the summer of 2019 into Temple in the middle of London. And I got off the tube and walking past the Royal Courts of Justice. And outside the Royal Courts of Justice was a gigantic blue model boat. I had no idea what it was about. And I went into Chambers and went into the room that I shared in Chambers. And one of my favourite people in Chambers was there. He's a guy called Ian Laurie, and he's a criminal judge. And I said, Ian, there's this massive blue boat outside the Royal Courts of Justice. He went, yeah, I know. It's in honour of my late wife, Polly Higgins, who recently very sadly passed away. And it's been put there by Extinction Rebellion to mark the work that she has done in trying to make ecocide a law. And it was the first time that I had ever heard the word ecocide. And I talked to him about what it meant. And he said, back in 19, people think she's mad. She is a one-woman at that point, solo mission to try and change the world. And she is being told by everyone, how can you possibly make the willful destruction of nature a criminal offence? Last September, Vanuatu, Fiji and Samoa, small islands in the South Pacific who are right at the front line of the devastation caused by rising sea levels, extreme weather, global warming and soil degradation, proposed to the Assembly to States parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, that ecocide be formally classified as an international crime, equal to, for example, genocide. Last year, an Ipsos survey found that 72% of people in the world's richest countries support an ecocide law. Now, around a dozen countries, including our next-door neighbours in France, already view ecocide as a crime. So this panel today could not be more timely. We are witnessing around the world unprecedented threats to the Earth's precious ecosystems upon which all of us here depend, including our need to feed 8 billion people. This is the year, 2025, that the Paris Agreement said was the year that greenhouse gas emissions had to peak at 1.5 warming before receding. I don't know if any of you have looked at the news this morning, but today there are articles which have been published showing it hasn't happened. Climate breakdown drove the annual global temperature above 1.5 degrees for the first time last year. 2024 was 1.6 degrees above pre-industrial levels, heat that has never been experienced by modern humans, and primarily caused by the burning of fossil fuels. In 2023, there was a report that showed that improving soil organic carbon by 1% in half of the world's agricultural soils would absorb enough CO2 to enable the world to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming without doing anything else. Farming, therefore, has to be the solution to the climate crisis rather than a contributor. But how can a law of ecocide help reshape economic and agricultural systems, how they operate, and speed up a transition to growing food with, not against, natural systems. And that is what this very distinguished panel are going to talk about today. To my immediate right is Jojo Mehta, CEO of Stop Ecocide International. She's at the forefront of the movement to make ecocide an international crime and has been pivotal in advancing diplomatic progress and building cross-sector support for that. Next to her is Martin Lyons, who's CEO of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. He's a farmer from South Cambridgeshire. He's got a wealth of experience, both literally on the ground and at policy level. And I hope we're going to be hearing from him how and if agroecology can thrive under a legal framework that deters some of the harmful practices of farming. And at the end is Rob Percival, who's head of food policy at the Soil Association. He's a writer, campaigner, and a food policy expert. So before we go into the moderated panel, which will take place before the Q&A, which will come at the end, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to have the floor for about 8 minutes, just to talk about what ecocide is and the role that they think it might play in this topic. Jojo, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you. And it's really great to be here. Last year, I actually spoke at the Oxford Farming Conference over at the exam schools, and I kept getting the sense that the Oxford Real Farming Conference was kind of fizzing and bubbling away, just a 5-minute walk away. And so I was just really excited to be here this year and speaking with all of you. It's just been an amazing couple of days just in terms of the amazing people that I've been bumping into. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Stop Ecocide International, which is now an international NGO. It was a public campaign that Polly and I co-founded in 2017. We kind of work on two levels. We work at the sort of diplomatic and political level, which is a lot of sort of advising, briefing, mostly kind of closed door work. And the other side of what we do is about communication. It's about tracking, reporting, amplifying everything around this particular issue, criminalization of ecocide around the world, and co-platforming in many different contexts with people from all different sectors, so whether from finance, law, academia, faiths, campaign groups, all sorts of people. And in order to kind of move this conversation forward. And we started off with a strapline of activating a law to protect the earth. That kind of moved forward to driving the global conversation on ecocide law. Now we just have simply developing ecocide law. And that just gives you a sense of the sort of trajectory of what has happened over the last few years. 5 years ago, there were no governments publicly talking about the criminalization of ecocide, with ecocide referring to those most severe, widespread and long-term harms to nature. And then over this last year, there have been a number of individual countries where ecocide law bills have been proposed, 1 or 2 where they've actually been adopted. The EU has adopted a directive that addresses some conduct which they're actually terming comparable to ecocide. First time it's been used in EU law. And there is now, as you just heard from Sarah, a proposal at the International Criminal Court from several states. The Pacific states proposed it. It's now supported by the Democratic Republic of Congo, highly significant African supporter. And so this is a conversation that is now very firmly at the diplomatic level. It's very live. The train has, if you like, left the station. And so this is, our role effectively has moved from demanding something to informing about something, because this is actually happening. Now, this audience probably doesn't need to sort of know very much about why it's important. But of course, there are many environmental laws in place around the world. And they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But as we all know, they're often woefully monitored, badly enforced, and sometimes just not followed because it's cheaper not to and nobody's checking. And actually, that particular phrase came from an agricultural company, in confidence. So there are lots of reasons why that's the case. But profoundly, and this has come up in a number of sessions I've been in already in the last 2 days, it's a major cultural issue. It's the same issue of separation, disconnection that we've been addressing in a number of different contexts. which means that our economic global system, which is based on that mindset, that Western mindset, doesn't really seem to have as its goal the continuation, let alone the thriving, of complex life on Earth. Effectively, what we're all living with is a kind of cognitive dissonance. And we can't escape it. I mean, all of us are hypocrites at some level in this. There's nothing we can do to avoid that because of the way that the system has developed. And cultural change takes a long time to actually, sort of gradual shift of attitudes. I firmly believe it is happening. I think the session that was here just before lunch really kind of tapped into that a bit. But we need systemic levers that can make rapid change. And we believe that criminal law has a particular role in that. People tend to associate criminal law with, punishment, and sometimes it's scary to bring criminal law into a conversation. But what is often forgotten is that criminal law is ultimately about protection. Murder is not a crime to punish murderers, that's how it works. But what it's for is to stop people killing each other. And so bringing that criminal parameter in as regards those worst harms is currently a gap, and it's something that that we believe can be really strongly deterrent and preventive, and effectively create a kind of legal safety rail. And it kind of delineating where there is a danger zone. I mean, if we build a factory, we don't do it so that it almost breaks people's heads open all the time, which is actually how we approach environmental regulation a lot of the time. It's kind of, how close can we get to that line? What we do is we build it so that we avoid breaking people's heads open. So there's a different attitude that comes with that kind of parameter, and in this case, in the criminal sphere. And as Sarah brought up, farming is so central to all of this because it both in its worst industrial forms is one of the most problematic sectors, but is also in its more regenerative, its agroecological and other forms, the most promising as well. So it feels like it's actually sort of fundamentally relevant. And you'll be hearing more from the farming experts around the relationship there sort of going forward. But also, as Sarah briefly mentioned, I mean, we thought that we would possibly at some point have to engage in a big public information and public persuasion campaign around this law. And what we have found is that's not remotely the case. And that poll that was conducted earlier this year, the Global Commons Alliance poll, came back with an average across the G20 countries and a few extra countries that 72% of people already think ecocide should be a crime. So there's a sense that this is something that is very much already in motion, and what we're needing to do now is to help people to understand what it means and how it can help in each sector. And this is the approach we take. We believe it is going to help everybody. We are all coexisting on this beautiful planet. And so, this is not actually about saying, pointing at a bad guy. It's about saying, here's something that's really going to help us get back on track. I just want to very, very briefly, actually we can come back to that later. Can we come back to the definition later, maybe? That might be a good place to stop for an introduction.
Yeah, and there's lots in there already that have sparked questions for me, which I'll come to in the panel. So keep them in mind if that has done the same for you for afterwards. Martin, you're coming at this from the guy with boots on the ground. So can you tell us a little bit, or I'll give the floor to you to talk about what you think Ecocide would, your understanding of it and how it ties into farming?
Yeah, thank you. And for me, I'll sort of go literally back to our farm and our journey on our own farm. We were a very mixed farm, and we had levers and policy that actually saw the environment as an inconvenience in the landscape, to move the trees, move the hedges, fill the ditches in. And we went on a journey of intensification. Nobody cared for nature. There's no value on nature, and it was kind of pushed to the sides and out the way. And then we suddenly realised that actually we've got unproductive areas. We put some habitat back in to buffer watercourses and bits. But then you start realising actually those pollinators are really important, those predatory insects and those other things. And that relationship of what farming does and operates in our landscape needs to coexist and enhance and work with nature, because that's where we get our food from and how the system works. So we need to bring nature in and sort of work with it and enhance it, and also recognise farming on the whole, in the UK and globally, has caused lots and lots of problems. And if we're going to tackle those problems, we need to look at how we farm in ways that puts nature front and centre, puts climate front and centre in the ways we manage the landscape for the food we produce and all the other goods and services. The majority of farmers in the UK are not producing food to feed people, they're feeding animals or energy plants. So we need to find that relationship of what we want from our landscape. But what we need to do is see that, and I've seen it through the network and travelling about, there's a lot of amazing farmers doing really, really good stuff and really sort of balancing their production and the environment and nature and moving along to that agroecological systems. But their produce is ending up in the same boxes and in the same lorries as everyone else's. And you look across the hedge or the ditch and the neighbour next door is doing some great things. But where's the balance? We're all selling into the same supply chain. We're all selling into the system that we currently operate in. So where do we have the distinction? Where are we having the difference? How do I know that the produce that's produced with nature at the heart is actually valued for what it is? So what we are seeing, various voluntary measures over years, not really delivering the outcomes that we want, never putting the baseline in. We have many supply chain using fancy labels and fancy language, but they turn a blind eye to what happens on the farm. If you look at when people are harvesting root vegetables or doing other practices, the consumer and the supply chain do not care or worry about how damaging you do to the soil to get your crop up, as long as they've got their bit. How do we connect up the harm the supply chain does in the landscape, not just in the UK, but globally? We've also seen our standards in the UK continually trying to lift for animal welfare, for the environment and for other things, banning certain products because we know they're bad for nature and bad for the environment, but then we're just allowed to imported products using exactly the same products that we've been banned from, or the animal welfare management. So I can see the opportunity of a law that actually puts a baseline to stop harm, not just here, but it's about where we balance that responsibility of who gets taken to court, because there is a bit of a risk that as a farmer I may be seen the one as doing the wrong thing because the supply chain's kind of disowned what I was doing, but they've asked me to do what they wanted to do. So it's about fitting that in and making a level playing field. And if we really want to accelerate a journey to a more agroecological system right across, we could have a law that actually puts a safe base level in, so we're actually fairly working together and actually stops greenwash, it stops bad practice happening, but it's about getting the language right and the wording right, but not putting all the weight and the risk to the farmer. But that gives us all the confidence then that we're in the same journey and we can share more knowledge. Farming is one of the few industries we share everything we're all doing and helping other businesses grow and develop. Other businesses, if you're a manufacturer, you don't tell your colleagues, your competitors, exactly your cost of production, how they manufacture it. But as farming industry, we do. And I think that's the exciting thing, that if we know there's a safe base level law there that stops that harm, how much quicker we can make this transition happen, how much sooner we can actually get everybody on this journey. Because currently, while we're in a conference with some amazing people, there's a conference up the road with some different mindsets, and there's many other mindsets in the landscape and farmers. And you hear on social media, they're not wanting to engage in environmental stuff. They want to focus on production at all costs. But the cost of environmental harm needs to be bedded into the system, that if we are going to reverse nature's decline and deliver solutions as farmers around climate solutions, that needs to be embedded right through the system at the same level so it works for everybody. So there's no disadvantage, but those early adopters may get some advantage because they're already doing it. Those recognitions of early markets and the early solutions are the ones that are already transitioning, and we can share the knowledge and really develop what we can do. So for me, it's having a baseline law that actually levels the playing field, and we're not going to offshore harm and turn a blind eye. We're consuming food that we're importing and causing harm in other places do we care as consumers? We don't, you shop, and we've got to join that up. We've got to kind of know that if you go into a shop, you're buying a product, you're not harming somewhere, and it builds that up. So I think, done well, that the balance right can really help farmers deliver the solutions society needs in delivering food production, but also a range of other produce and outcomes from our landscapes that joins it all up. So for me, it's getting it right, but really putting the power of the farmer at the heart of it and giving them the trust and the support to get the outcomes right.
Thank you so much, Martin. And that is such an incredibly important point about the collaboration and the power in that collaboration amongst this regenerative farming movement. And whilst, of course, we're all here talking about incredible sort of hard data and the law, one of the things I will never forget, if you ever have a chance to go to Martin's farm, take it. I went, I think, for the first time maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I will never forget Martin's face walking through part of the field that had been out of production for maybe a year or two. And as he walked through it, the entire thing rose up with insects around him. And he turned around with this smile on his face and went, I don't know what any of this is, but I love that it's here. And, that joy, the recognition of taking ownership again of the joy of farming is something that Martin does so beautifully, and so many of the farmers who are here have done so beautifully. And being able to share that, as well as the technical detail, I think is going to be so pivotal in how this movement motors forward. Going back to the detail in food policy with Rob, who, as head of food policy at Sol Association, is used to gnarly conversations with people possibly from around the corner. Rob, can you tell us what your view is about how we might be able to use a law like this to speed up this transition that you've been involved in, taking into account all of the things that Martin's just said, of course, about supply chains and how little power farmers on the ground have in that?
Certainly. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me. So I think it's worth first unpicking what we mean by this transition to agroecology. I think we're all conscious that we're not just talking about a change in farming practice, but agroecology, if understood as a sort of social political movement, implies a much broader suite of changes across the food system. We're talking about changes in how we eat, how we relate to food, cultural changes in food politics, and those changes extend as well up to the legal system. We need not just better laws, as we've heard, but a different set of values embedded in the legal system, a different legal architecture that enables that transition. And I perceive Ecocide law to have a potentially really useful role to play in that space, alongside other forms of sort of earth jurisprudence, earth-centered law. Various different rights of nature approaches are emerging around the world, none of which on their own are the sort of the sole answer, but all of which represent this sort of growing potential to shift the way the law relates to nature. And I think it's worth sort of unfolding what we're talking about with nature as well in the context of a climate crisis. There's been lots of discussion I've heard the last few days around the language we use. What does this word regen mean? Should we still be using the word sustainable, and so on? And the climate crisis, I think, could be better described as an interspecies genocide. It's a process of unfolding genocidal violence inflicted by industrial civilization against all these other life forms with whom we share this planet. And at the moment, they're not recognized in law. Nature, such that it appears in law, is typically property. Such that it appears in policy, including in the UK, is typically framed as being of instrumental value. We talk about natural capital and ecosystem services and so on. It's rarely recognized for its own intrinsic value. And that's where I see Ecocide law being of potential benefit. It does root nature's value in that sort of intrinsic space. It says it's valuable in its own right, and it provides one plausible mechanism for that sort of genocidal violence, if I can call it that, to be held to account, for some sort of justice to be brought about, and some reparation potentially as well. So I see, in as far as it embodies a different set of values, a different way of relating to nature, there to be this potential resonance between ecocide law and the values that underpin the agroecology movement, which are to some degree certainly more nature-centric, earth-centric than society at large, if I can call it that. I guess I have some, not doubts, but I'm yet to be convinced of the practical value of ecocide law. So the International Criminal Court, for example, can hold individuals to account, but not governments or businesses. I'm no expert, do correct me if I'm wrong, Jojo. It has a sort of history of disproportionately prosecuting actors from the global south, which is to say it hasn't successfully held actors in the global north to account. So there's some questions in my mind around what role the International Criminal Court could plausibly play as a sort of an actor in this space to help protect nature. I guess, again, we'll hear more from the actual experts, but this is a very new legal space. To what degree have we seen this law actually driving change? We can think very positively in sort of hypothetical terms about what might be different in the UK, but I think it's going to be very interesting over the next few years as different countries, different national governments do adopt this, as there is this momentum behind it, to see the spaces where it can drive change. And to come back to your question, I think, there's definitely a need for the law to be aimed and angled at the right actors. So I think it'd be tremendously helpful and positive if Avara and Tesco, thinking about the chicken supply, were having conversations about ecocide law and their responsibilities with respect to the River Wye, for example. If we can force those conversations at a board level and create this new domain of risk and financial investment, that would be tremendously positive. But of course, we don't want individual farmers who have been backed into damaging practices to bear the brunt of it. So I'll stop there.
That is really helpful and interesting. And as the only person, I think, on this panel who spent 10 years in a wig and a gown and therefore stands here as the law, what was so interesting about how you started about the idea that this is a failure of the law is that I think it's important. I've been thinking about this a lot over the last year. It's a really good reminder to really think about what the law is. The law is not inherent. It isn't given to us on tablets. It is reflective of society. It's what we want it to be. We empower our lawmakers, and they make the law that we want when they consider there is a tipping point that means that society thinks the law is right or wrong. And you can pick out many examples, whether that is the suffrage movement, votes for women, gay marriage, whatever it might be. So I think it's really helpful to start this discussion thinking about what the law is. It's malleable. It is what we want it to be. We just need to be able to tell people what we want it to be, the people being the lawmakers. And so maybe that's a good place to start with you, Jojo, and asking about the definition of it, because the devil is in the detail with any law. And what definition you're asking for ecocide, so that we can think about how that might fit in to agroecological farming.
Absolutely. And I think this is absolutely seminal. The first use of the term ecocide actually goes back to 1970. It was first used on the diplomatic stage and at the first UN Environment Conference in 1972. But it's like it was almost in a sort of political and legal backwater for a number of decades. And it was Polly Higgins, who I co-founded this with, who resurrected the term. And there have been a number of different definitions of what ecocide might be over the years. But to have one lawyer or a small group of lawyers say, well, we think it should look like this, is one thing, but to have a government take it seriously is another one. And we were actually given the opportunity in the summer of 2020, we had politicians from Sweden approach us and say, could you, this is obviously your area of expertise. By that point, we had a charitable foundation as well. Could you commission a definition of ecocide that would have the level of credibility that we could take to our government and say, would you propose this as an international crime? And on the basis of that request, we were able to bring together a panel of 12 lawyers from all around the world. So, geographically diverse, sort of, mix of genders, ethnicities, and so on. But it was also a mix of different legal backgrounds. So criminal law, climate law, humanitarian law, but also ideologies. So we had, for example, a former ICC judge was one of that panel, and so was an international barrister, Philippe Sands, very established in the international law world. But we also had what you might call people's lawyers or activist lawyers. We had Pablo Fajardo, who worked on the Chevron case in Ecuador, and we had Valerie Cabanas, who was a really, really strong voice for Ecocide in the Francophone world. We had, it was a huge range. And what that meant is what emerged had to be a genuine consensus. Everyone had to sacrifice something. And the definition that they emerged with was basically sort of 2 paragraphs long. One of them has a sort of more detailed definition of terms, but the core of it is really very simple. And we've actually got it on a slide. There it is. And it's really short. So ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, that actually has really strong legal precedent in a number of treaties and also other aspects of the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the International Criminal Court. But it's also incredibly easy to understand. I mean, for you, it's really quite straightforward. And there are a couple of very key things about it that I think have relevance across many sectors, but will have relevance here too. Firstly, we're not just looking at if you create this level of damage, that's it, it's crime, end of story. It has to be unlawful or wanton. So it acknowledges the fact that there are different bodies of law in different places around the world, and that a lot of the worst harms are already in breach of those frameworks. So you're not creating a new crime out of nowhere, which is not how international crime works. You're enhancing a framework which is not adequate. Okay, and that actually creates a palatability politically as well, because it shows a kind of respect for the existing regulatory systems. And also for the fact that there are differences there, but it also keeps it dynamic. It means that everybody, and I'm sure there are some in this room, who is working on improving environmental regulation in any given area will also be improving this definition as it moves forward. So that's really, really important that it has these 2 aspects, the severity of the harm and that second threshold. The other aspect that I want to highlight is the fact that this is a consequence-focused definition. Most environmental law is in the regulatory sphere. There are some crimes, but mostly it's in this sort of administrative or civil regulation. Mostly it's quite detailed, lots of pages of do's and don'ts, how much of a certain toxin is allowed in a certain context, all of that sort of thing. Now, that's very important for people to know what they should be doing, but at the same time, it is very tempting, particularly for larger corporations that can afford to do so, to game that system. And to basically say, this is what's prohibited, this specific thing. Well, we're not doing exactly that. We're doing something slightly different, and therefore we're not falling foul of it. Or, taking something right up to the line in terms of how toxic what they're doing is. Or just, frankly, balancing out the cost of compensation against the cost of, against the benefits of profit. What this kind of definition does is something very different. It kind of forces the operational people, the risk managers and legal counsels in those companies to actually be saying, well, what are we doing on the ground? And will it create that level of harm? Because there are no specifics. So that does 2 things. One, it doesn't point the finger at specific industries, which will then obviously resist massively. It's across the board. But secondly, it stimulates questions. It stimulates effectively questions that should be being asked, but maybe aren't. Let's say, if we're, is this particular pesticide that we're using on an industrial scale, creating this level of harm? Will it be affecting an entire ecosystem, a cross-border situation, a whole species? All of these kinds of things which come into the more detailed aspects. And what should we be doing instead? Because that question is not currently being asked. So there's a stimulation of the constructive kinds of questions that lead to answers. And what I would say there, and I love the way you brought up the kind of collaborative sort of aspect of farming, because there is something that I find deeply inspiring about human beings, which is that when we ask questions, we find answers. That is actually the way our brains work. So the fact that a lot of alternative ways of doing things are out there, but they're not being looked into, is because those questions are not being asked. So the framework kind of acts in that manner. So I'll leave it there for now. But I think those are a couple of the really key aspects of this. And that definition, which came out of that panel, is also the definition that has now been proposed at the International Criminal Court.
Thinking about definitions in that context, Martin, what you said, and Rob picked up as well, which maybe underpins why you talked about this kind of disconnect in farming and the food system from nature, that there is just no value placed on it, economic or otherwise. And what Rob said about definitions in law. I don't know if anyone's looked up the dictionary definition of nature, but I have. And it is defined by its distinction from a human being. So nature is something that isn't human. I mean, that is mad, isn't it? Mad. But that's what it is. And so when we're talking about the consequences of definitions to then send us down a path, that is what that has done. By distinguishing nature from us as humans, it has separated us from nature. And so definitions are incredibly important in terms of the outcome, in terms of what flows from that. So Martin, having kind of seen and heard about the definition of ecocide and thinking about how that might fit in with farming, what do you think? What are you excited about, and what are you worried about in terms of how that might play in to on the boots on the ground farming?
I think it's going to open up a whole lot of questions that are going to be difficult for people to understand and think about, because if we put nature at the heart, what does that mean? And whose responsibility is it? Is it the farmers doing the action of pouring the chemical on or doing the act? Or is it the supply chain that's putting that into the contract that it must be harvested at this date and that regardless of the weather or something? So it's about, I think it's going to unravel a whole lot of questions of actually, are we intentionally harming something, or is it accidentally harming something? And we know farming harms nature because we're disturbing that landscape by producing something. But we're doing it in an intentional way, but not to go too far that causes production to stop and other things. So where is that level? And then where is that shared responsibility right through the industry, that everybody can take their step and responsibility, because there's an understanding of the role of nature right through. Because I think that's what we need to try and look at, how do we balance out that actually nature underpins all of everything. And I find that definition of nature is everything but us. And I think that's a really strange way of looking at it, because we are nature as well. When we die, we're going to return to nature, whether that's ash or worms or whatever, but that's where we end up, back in there, and we're in that cycle. But to separate us out, it makes me think we've got to rethink the language we use, the words we use, and make sure they're putting in to encompass a new future with a new definition of where our system for nature, farming, food, the whole lot leads into a place that actually gets to a good place, but that has legal definitions that actually support it. We know governments do weak law sometimes because it's convenient for them. They won't go that extra mile because they might be held accountable. We've seen the various things that, how does society, we set that framework sometimes and have a support to go as far as we need to go and go that little bit extra. And then we can hold people to account to get the right outcomes.
Thank you. Rob, I was really interested in moving on from that to how it gets to the policy makers, the arguments that you're having, presumably, over the table with those who are able to sort of create a definition and then enact it. I was just thinking about what Jojo said about this being a cultural battle that your campaign thought you would have to fight, but don't. And I was thinking about a panel I once went to listen to about green energy, and there were some pretty sharp-suited 40-something-year-old guys on a panel and one woman, And all of the sharp-suited guys said, it's just really difficult to get change. It's impossible to get people to change how they live. It's really slow and difficult. And the woman, who was from Octopus Energy Company, leans forward and went, can I just say that's bullshit? And I'll give you 2 examples. 1, smartphones. 2, COVID. If you make something incredibly convenient and easy, if you make it the easier choice, people learn really fast how to use it to a point where they can't remember their life before they had it in there. And the second way of doing it is to not let them, by making it illegal to leave your home, a concept so dystopian that I think if you'd proposed it to us 5 years ago, we would have laughed at you, but we all did it because it was the law. So this idea of cultural change, of course, is bound up in how you get there. And of course, policy is going to be a massive part of that. So what kind of resistance do you think the people that you talk to on behalf of the Soil Association have to this? And how do you think we can persuade them that it's possible?
Great question. So before I answer that bit, quick shout out to Lawyers for Nature, who successfully got the dictionary changed just a few months ago. They the campaign, the brainchild of Jess Mondwed, and they managed to persuade Cambridge, I think it was, maybe Oxford Cambridge Dictionary, into reviving what they had listed as a defunct definition of nature, which was inclusive of humans. And they organised a whole campaign around it. So there is now a new dictionary definition. The old one's still in there as well, putting us in opposition. But that was a good campaign and a fun sort of symbolic victory. With respect to policy and society, and I think there's something really interesting that's come out of the multiple citizen assembly type activities that have been held over recent years, the climate assemblies associated with Extinction Rebellion. There's been the food conversation, Food Farming Countryside Commission has run. There have been nature assemblies and so on. What they have consistently shown is that the British public are hungry for government action, willing to see more regulation, tighter regulation, and B, a sort of groundswell of concern about corporate influence over policy making, the role of big business in shaping the natural environment, the food system, people's lives. In the media, what we see is this very distracting and dishonest story about the nanny state. No one wants government intervention. It's all hyped up, and it's the usual actors who are saying the same things over and over again. And it's been very influential. It's been a real blocker to environmental action, food system change, and so on. But it's nonsense. There isn't a widespread public concern about the nanny state. It's various actors in the sort of media space doing their thing. What we're seeing on the ground through those citizen assemblies is real appetite for regulation and potentially legal change as well, to hold powerful corporate actors to account. So I'm not really surprised that Ecocide, which in itself is a kind of intuitive concept, you can get what it means. I'm not surprised that it has been picked up and is seeming popular, that you don't need that mass education campaign. I think it resonates with the values and thought processes that are already out there. So in terms of how we influence policy, we need to bring all that into a compelling argument, a narrative, help fight off the predictable sort of counter-arguments, and build a sort of broad coalition of support behind this.
I don't know, has anyone here heard of Lawyers for Nature or is aware of their work? When we're talking, I think, which is at the heart of this topic of how we define something and how that massively impacts what actually happens, they are a fascinating part of that. Not just because of that, which shows that I should have looked it up this morning rather than a few months ago, but also because I went to a Lawyers for Nature event in London. I thought I'd be the only person there. There was like 30 people there, all looking quite bemused about what was going to happen. And one of the things that I remember taking away from it, and I was listening to Jojo talk about, whether you're an environmental lawyer, was this. They said, every law is environmental. In the same way that we should be looking at every farming practice being environmental. Once you get a prism through which you look, it changes the outcome of it. So they said human rights law is environmental. You can look at property law through an environmental prism, shipping law, contract law, family law. Every part of law you can look at it through an environmental prism. There shouldn't be such a thing as an environmental lawyer. It just goes into all of it. In the same way that there shouldn't be an idea of food and nature, because they're the same. And it's the prism through which you look at something that then, of course, materially affects its outcome. So, for example, one of the brilliant things that they have done, which plays into exactly that and maybe shows us how we can bring this into farming, they have, in fact, were approached by a cosmetic company who makes shampoo. And they said, we want to get nature on the board. We want an independent person on our board who represents nature, so that every single decision we make as a company, we go to them and say, what would nature do? And they've done it. Imagine if that was on the board of the Oxford Farming Conference, or here, or wherever, on all of the ways through which we look at any interpretations. Martin, can I ask you something off that, which is, if we start to look at decisions in farming through this prism, that is going to have a consequence, obviously, a practical consequence on farmers. And as we know from things like the inheritance tax debate and otherwise, sometimes there is fear without necessarily understanding the detail of it. Or there is fear of the potential of it, even if that risk is very low. And we, all farmers now know that thanks to Mark, I can't remember his surname, the farmer who was sent to prison for dredging a river, John Price, you can go to prison as a farmer for destroying nature if you're prosecuted for it. So that's real now, it's not hypothetical. So what do you think are going to be the concerns from farmers when we start talking about an Ecocide law that's going to have an impact on their businesses? And how are we able to bring farmers with us rather than have a division that then sits without any of the nuance? Because as we all know, no one really listens after the but. So how do you think we're going to do that?
I think we need to clearly think about how we communicate it, how we explain it. There will always be some that want to put a divide in it, and there's always us and those. There's other voices that want to highlight the risk or the challenge. But I think it's really at communicating that it isn't all on the farmer's shoulder. Because my honest concern is, am I to blame? Will that mean, am I going to be the one locked up? Because have I done something wrong? So it's about easily communicating that this is a framework, this is the risk, is it severe and widespread? What have you intentionally done? And this is what we mean by intentionally doing something. So we can help farmers understand that accidents happen, but that wasn't intentional. But if you're continually farming in a way or doing something that does intentionally cause problems, you have a risk coming to you. But also that risk then is, if it's driven by the supply chain, is a shared risk because the supply chain needs to carry some of that. So I think it's about building the case and the communication and helping farmers understand that it could be challenging, but it's not designed to be challenging. It's designed to be enhancing and uplifting and setting a fair baseline.
Rob, you've already talked a little bit about your kind of frustration with the International Criminal Court not being able to prosecute the people that you would like them to prosecute, or the bodies that you think should be held accountable, if I've understood that correctly. And Jojo's already mentioned that you can have a law, but it's no good if it's not enforced. It's a bit like what we all have known from the Environment Agency or what's happened in the River Eye. Just because the law is there, it's not worth anything until it has teeth and it's actionable. So in terms of what you would like to see in how this plays out within agroecology, what do you think has to happen after, if an Ecocide law comes into force, to actually give it teeth and allow it to do what it needs to do to speed up this transition?
So I'm not a legal expert. So I guess Jojo might have more to say on that specifically. I think it's really important, the first few precedents, the first few times this happens, is going to set the tone for how it plays out. It's going to set the tone politically, it's going to set the tone in terms of the legal precedent that's set, that then informs future decision making. So we have to get it right from the beginning. And I'm sure Stop Ecocide International are on the case with this, thinking about the positive and less positive ways this could play out. I think we need, within the UK, certainly with respect to farming, land use, our supply chains, a real shift towards being willing to use the stick. We need regulators to regulate. We need laws to be enforced. How you go about doing that is the challenge, as you say. But I think if we can somewhere in the legal system in Europe and various of our neighbouring countries bring this to fruition and see some positive examples of the difference it can make, that will set the tone for how it can be implemented here in the UK.
Jojo, what do you think about that? I mean, do you know if there have been any examples which we could use exactly as Rob has just said to set the tone for it?
Yeah, I mean, it's all quite new. I mean, for international law, the speed that this has been moving is obviously very fast. So it's kind of new ground. There are, I mean, for example, France has something in place. It's not actually, they don't classify it as a crime, but as a sort of offence or like a misdemeanor. It's something that's sort of like, they haven't quite put it at the level that we would put it at. Their law came out actually just before this definition, and we kind of wish it had happened a little bit later. But there is a case ongoing. But I think initial cases will be really important. And one of my colleagues came back from a law conversation where somebody was talking about the whole kind of carrot and stick metaphor, which is obviously very familiar to everybody. And the important aspect there was that they're both important, carrots and sticks. Your incentives and your potential punishments. But the good thing about sticks is they don't need using much, because actually that once the stick gets used well a couple of times, then suddenly everything else gets taken more seriously. And one of the big aspects of Ecocide law is it's not meant to catch the average farmer. It's just not. That's not what it's designed for. If you're putting something at the level of an international crime, where it has to be severe, in other words, majorly disruptive to an ecosystem, it needs to be either widespread or long-term or irreversible. And for example, I mean, I suppose in the UK, the obvious example might be the sewage in the rivers situation, where there's an entire river system is affected. So you're looking at the kind of scale. It has to be quite big, or it needs to be cross-border, or it needs to affect a whole species, or something like that. So it's not meant to catch everything. It's meant to create a kind of an outer boundary, which then has the rest of the edifice of environmental law taken more seriously. Because you can imagine, a board of directors is going to have a very different approach to its existing obligations if it knows that if it's in breach of those and it's threatening really severe harm, then you're looking at a personal tap on the shoulder. And that speaks a little bit to what you were talking about who does the ICC prosecute? The ICC prosecutes individuals. And of course, that's not adequate, particularly in terms of compensation, because individuals often can't compensate for a very expensive and damaging situation. But it's very important in terms of the cultural side and in terms of how people understand it as a preventive. Because, we've spoken to, because we speak to so many different sectors, and we've spoken to, people in banking and finance, and they are hyper aware that individual criminal responsibility has a totally different effect to a sort of regulatory obligation. And you only have to look at something like the Enron situation. When the fraud was discovered, the stock value plummets. So you've got this kind of double layer of potential deterrence with ecocide that you don't maybe have with something like genocide that's ideologically motivated. And actually, when it comes to the intentional thing, most ecocide is not intentional as such, it's reckless. So it's about you knew and you did it anyway, rather than you said to yourself, I'm going to destroy the rainforest, for example. So it's a bit of a different environment. But the other thing I think that's important is that from the enforceability perspective, it's actually going to be national jurisdictions that do the enforcement most of the time, because the ICC is meant to be a complementary court. It's meant to be a court of last resort. Now, if you're a war criminal or a genocidal maniac, your country isn't going to prosecute you for obvious reasons, right? You're going to end up at the court of last resort. And then the ICC struggles with the cases that it's got and also ends up with these accusations, understandably, of colonialism, etc. But if you have an international law in place that is relevant to everybody that is going to ratify it, they're going to ratify it and apply it in their own jurisdictions. And with Ecocide, you can do that in a way that's easier than perhaps the other existing environmental crimes. And I'll just round off that by saying that, interestingly, it's the African countries and the Latin American countries that are really interested in this. So, because actually there's a way that is seen as a recourse and an accountability factor for predatory foreign investors. So, there's some really interesting, dynamics there.
Just to push, maybe that's putting it too strong, not push back, but just to go into that with one example that came to mind. When you're talking about that definition, and I was listening kind of carefully and thinking through practices on the farm that I know lots of people do, and whether that would fit in with that. And I suspect, I'm putting words into his mouth, but Craig Bennett, who's sitting in the front row, might say that the use of neonicotinoids, now that we have much more evidence about the consequences of neonicotinoids on bees and pollinators, and how that is severe and widespread long-term damage to those pollinators, so much so that Kent apple growers 2 years ago were down something like £5 million because there just aren't the pollinators to pollinate their orchards. How do you stop the person who's using neonicotinoids, because if they don't, oilseed rape's going to be imported anyway from a country that does use neonicotinoids? How do you stop that farmer who's been sold that from being prosecuted? Because I can see that it might fit into that, now that we've got the science behind what it does long-term to bee colonies and other pollinators.
The likelihood is it wouldn't, in the sense that, it would have to be a pretty damn big farm for that to be the case, for a single farmer to be prosecuted for something like that. And in the instance that you're describing, you'd be looking more at the pesticide manufacturers.
Well, that's the
so there's some interesting things. And obviously, I'm not going to say exactly how that would play out because I don't know. And in terms of an international crime, it's not yet. It's not yet in place. There may be things that are sort of shifted over time. But I think the principle of this definition has stood the test of time over 3 years. So in principle, it would be there. But this is not aimed at sort of small, medium enterprises. This is aimed at decision makers that are capable of making a decision that has a really drastic effect. And so, for example, you could be looking at, someone asked Philippe Sands this, one of the key lawyers who worked on the definition, how would this affect, say, in the climate environment, how would this affect fossil fuel production and those kinds of things? Or how would it affect fossil fuel use? Now, obviously, that's a cumulative thing. We all do that. So, no, it's not aimed at that. But his response was, well, I can see a point in the future where a policy decision to open a new coal mine or a new production facility might be something that could potentially be looked at in this. So, it's more those kinds of situations that I think that are potentially more likely to fall under something like Ecocide. As I say, unless what's happening is that there's such a geographical scale of what is happening that, yes, it would constitute that. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that it would need to be on a pretty big scale. But at the same time, you're touching on this thing of so are people going to not bother worrying about it, or are they going to bother worrying about it? But the very fact that that edge is there already is potentially transformative.
Yeah. Well, there's lots more that I would have to ask, but I'm going to open it to the floor. We've got some questions for 20 minutes or so. So if anyone, there's a roving mic, so put up your hands if you have questions. A hand went up right at the back. I better put my specs on, I can't see anyone.
Do you want me to stand up?
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah, so you finished using the word scale there, which is a quite emotive term for ecologists. And I can see there are several subjective terms in here, like substantial, severe, widespread and long-term, which are nice terms for lawyers to argue among themselves about in any case. So my question is that all of those terms have very different meanings if you're a different species. So what is widespread for you and what is widespread for, say, a bee or a lizard, which lives its life in 30 meters, are quite different. So my question is, how do you think we will tackle kind of the education of lawyers, juries and judges sufficiently to see things from the point of view of other species, to be able to argue this law in a real way that represents species needs, accounting for the fact that widespread is very subjective and what's widespread to them might not be widespread to us. Thank you.
Great question. Jojo, do you want to start with that? And then come to Rob as well.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating one. And it's interesting that because we're so used to very specific limits and specific numbers around environmental regulation, we think that this is problematic. I'm not saying that it's, that it doesn't have issues around it, one of which you just brought up, but in criminal law, it's actually quite familiar to use terms like a reasonable length of time, a substantial amount of harm, a severe and widespread and long term, because it will depend on the context. So let's say, a simple example, if I walk down the street and someone beats me up, it's not the number of bruises that will tell a court whether it was attempted murder or whether it was just a drunken assault. It's to do with the entire context. So when the panel was looking at, was drafting this definition, some of the precedents did have, kilometrages around what widespread meant, but they realized that actually, for example, there was a consultation done at the beginning of the drafting process, and one of the aspects of that was 5 indigenous speakers, one from each continent, and what was really striking about that discussion was that none of them used the term nature. They just didn't think of nature as something else. So there wasn't a term. There was a term Mother Earth, and there were cultural practices, but there wasn't a term for Mother Nature. Now, for nature separately. Now, how that ended up reflecting in the panel was that, you can't see it in the core part of the definition, but under severe, cultural is one of the aspects that could be severely disrupted by environmental harm. And that might not be, tens or hundreds of kilometres wide, if that mining company in Australia that destroyed the Aboriginal sacred site, which in itself was quite a small location, potentially under this definition, that would be ecocide because of that particular context. So there is a contextual element that actually criminal courts are quite familiar with dealing with. Whether or not they would actually take into account what a lizard considers to be widespread, I honestly don't know. I think that might be going a bit beyond what the current system is capable of. But this is nonetheless obviously it's a very specific, but it's a rather massive step, in the right direction, we hope.
No, it's a fascinating question. Rob, I don't know if you want to, I know, caveat, you're not a legal expert, although as you were asking that question, especially about juries, I imagined a time where you would genuinely have 12 members of the public deciding things like that, which is both, well, I am a believer in the jury system, so I think it was an extraordinary image to have. You listened carefully to that. What response would you have to some of the kind of concerns flagged in it and how you might get around it, or not?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it touches on this this broader question of interspecies representation, interspecies dialogue. How do we enable that, make sense of that? We heard about Lawyers for Nature working with House of Hackney to put nature on the board. The other case study that comes to mind, which is pertinent to this, which I think is fascinating, is that DEFRA, the UK government, recently held its first interspecies council. So they worked with this organisation called Moral Imaginations, and there's a case study on the DEFRA website, on the government website you can go find, where they went through a structured process of dialogue. I think it was in relation to a river ecosystem, where different living organisms in that ecosystem were represented, obviously imperfectly, by a human actor. And there was a process of deliberation around a particular decision, trying to bring those different species perspectives into view. And it sounds quite out there, but this is DEFRA. And it's not about to become a main part of a formal part of DEFRA decision-making. But there are things happening around the fringes, really interesting things. This was, as I say, Moral Imaginations who are leading this, and they're working in various other spaces to tee up similar conversations. So how you go about bringing that type of thought process into legal spaces, into spaces like ORFC, I think is a fascinating provocation.
Maybe they will be the expert evidence in that courtroom then. Any other questions?
Should we take a few?
Lady, yeah, so maybe we should take lady on the end and then Steve in the middle.
I guess this one's for Jojo. So would you count Ecocide for, say, really large multinational meat processing companies such as JBS, which is known as the largest in the world, based in Brazil. They're very much known for deforestation, the displacement of indigenous communities, and then they are then linked to across the world as well. So they own Moy Park, which is based in Northern Ireland, but they have links all around the world and then supply the produce to supermarkets, which we buy, unaware that the link goes back to JBS. I would argue that it would, but I'd like to know from the expert at what point, we would go after these multinational companies which have so much influence globally. I wouldn't imagine it's an easy task to make, but interested.
And while the microphone's there, if you could just pass it to your left. So Jojo, for you, how and why? And
Stephen Jacobs, Organic Farmers and Growers and the Organic Growers Alliance. In organics, we have to rely on trading standards to enforce the rules. As Sarah's already said, trading standards and the Environment Agency have had resources depleted. So on the question of enforcement, how would we refund or fund additional resources somehow? At least in organics, we're constantly looking. So if there's an infringement of the organic regulation, we can alert trading standards. Even then, it can be a bit of a slog to get them to do anything. But that's not their fault. That's because of lack of funding. In the Dasgupta review, they talk about assets, and it was a Treasury-sponsored review. Would levies work? How do we do it? Because enforcement is absolutely key. Nobody's really looking, especially the Environment Agency, because they don't have the resource.
Martin, I might ask you about that, because I know you have conversations with DEFRA regularly, and I imagine bang the same drum about funding. So maybe I can ask Jojo to answer the first question. Martin, you answer the second.
It's funny. We don't, on the whole, look at very specific instances of companies at present, because what we're working on is getting the law in place. That effectively, we're not actually lawyers, we're communicators. I mean, we work with a lot of our legal associates, we work with a lot of lawyers. But our job is working with legislators to move forward the actual development of ecocide law and get it in place. So it would, the exact, how a particular case would be taken will depend on particular circumstances in particular countries and so on. Now, don't get me wrong, I completely understand what you did. But at the same time, if you ask any lawyer at this stage, they will say they don't know because this is something that's a work in progress, if you like. What we would fully anticipate is that those are exactly the kind of companies where their boards of directors will start thinking very carefully about their practices, and that is one of the key things. And the only other thing I would say is that there's quite a big temptation because of how, what a difficult situation we are in ecologically globally, is to look at something like ecocide law, which is actually a real kind of spark of hope in the sense that it's really moving forward and has been very sort of successful in terms of legislative direction of travel, is to kind of hang an awful lot onto it. And to want it to sort of fix everything. That's not what it's about. And I would go back to what Rob said originally. It's one of a number of tools. We would say that it is a necessary one, but a not sufficient one. I mean, without a parameter like this, very little else will really be able to stay fixed. But it will not fix everything. So it's kind of that's kind of where I would sit with that, which I realise is probably not as clear an answer as you would like. But
no, that's good. Thank you, Martin. I mean, Steve's questions like, how do we get the money? I mean, that's what we all want to know, right? I imagine that conversation has come up almost hourly in the last 2 days. There's not enough. How do we get it? I imagine a large amount of your year is spent asking that for various people. So I don't know that you can tell us how we get more money, because that's what we've all been asking for. But maybe I can take the liberty of reframing that and saying, do you think that this would help get more money for enforcement, for all of the sort of departments that have been savaged with cuts to make them mostly toothless? Can you see that it would, or do you think it would end up just catching the little guy rather than the big guy?
So if we want more money, but who pays? a lot of the problems we have, environment and other things, we are picking up as society through other actions that we're having to do to clean things up. So the person causing the harm has been getting away with it, but we're still having to pay. So I think it's talking to government and that, instead of just focusing on enforcement and who pays the enforcement thing, it is understanding by having that enforcement, you're saving significant cost by the clean-up action that needs to be delivered. So it's making sure the person, the organisation, the system that's causing the harm pays for has to sort itself out. So I think we have to really be thinking about investing in these things or putting structures in place to do enforcement that brings income back in to deliver the return but mitigates the risk that's over there that we're paying for anyway. So much, if we look at the health of the society and NHS costs, the majority of the costs going forward is going to be tackling our health issues that we are feeding ourselves in the system. So I think we've got to have these conversations with government, and it's not just about calling more money, it's about how it's going to save money and how that enforcement, and I do think having that law there puts some structure in that actually gives some focus around you've got someone to go for because they're causing the problem intentionally and willingly. So I think it's the right way. But the government have got no money, so we need to be able to communicate it in a different way that gives them the hope and the inspiration to unlock things and puts the right investment in the right places.
No, quite. I mean, one statistic I always bang out about this is that last year, the cost of treating diabetes for the NHS, 90% of which is diet-related, is the same as our entire legal budget. Courts, community service, probation, prisons, the lot. Which is means-tested. So if you get arrested and your household income is over a certain amount, you've got to pay for your own defence. So that argument of prevention over cause, of course, is a good funding one. There's one question standing up, and then another question to the left, please.
Thank you. Hi. For the last 10 years I've been involved in this game. The one thing I hear about on an international level is the indigenous people don't marginalise the people who are in the global south because that's where all the resources are being mined the most. But then in tandem with that, for the last 10 years, I've come into events wherever in London, like climate change, and naturally, if I'm told the people who are the most relevant are the people in the global south who are African or Indian like me, those Indian and African brothers and sisters who could probably teach you a thing or two, I don't see them. Where are the Indians in India and the Indians in America whose land, and I've been saying this for 10 years, when our indigenous land is not just mined for the fossil fuels, is mined, hear this please, it is mined for your transition to go green. You've got African blood, Indian blood, Chinese blood, South American blood. Yet we're saying to divest from the fossil fuels that was given to the global south 250 years ago by the British, misusing their lands and uses. What I find trite and disturbing is I'm one of very few ethnic majority here. 5% of the speakers of this conference is only ethnic majority. Yet we are always told that our voices are important. So my question is, will any litigation lawyers from the global north help the people in the indigenous and the global south to litigate against those mining companies that are stealing our cobalt and bauxite and lithium for this transition to go green? When you've got farmers in Ghana whose land has been stolen not for cattle farming, but so that land can be ripped up and mining companies can get the cobalt out of the ground so we can have this pesky electric car in the UK, virtue signal how green it is, but pay no credence to the 5-year-old children in Congo. So legally, if this is not bringing any respite or justice to the Africans or the Indians, For me, this is a complete load of tosh. Is it going to really say fossil fuels? No, because fossil fuels powers the renewables economy that we need supposedly in the UK and the rest of the world. But still, the Global South, which is 94% of the world's population, is still marginalized by laws that should be helping them, but actually is going against them. Where are the African lawyers, the Indian lawyers, to tell them from their perspective? We're not here. Why? 10 years later, I'm still asking this, and people saying, oh, we can't forget about you, but we're just not going to have you on the panel. All right, thank you very much. I'll just bugger off back to India and actually tell our Indian people, do not mine our mountains, which have been there since the time of Krishna. Do not mine our resources and steal them so you can have your solar panels. This is what we need to discuss.
Thank you for asking that. And within that's two questions. One is about voices, representation, and listening and understanding. And the second one is how this can help the people who are currently being impacted most in this unfair distribution.
Yeah, no, I'd love to take that actually. So firstly, we are in Oxford, we're in England. I go to a lot of international conferences where there is a far greater percentage of all different colours and different races and different places and different ethnicities, because it's also about where a conference is located. That is one of the things. And also the other thing that I would say is that actually we have a huge number of Indigenous voices backing this and wanting this. We have the African countries are some of the most interested in this, in fact. Because one of the things that it represents is how can we develop safely? How can we develop without creating huge destruction? And how can we have recourse against those who come in from the outside and, wreak destruction and then, bugger off again, excuse my language. So actually it's hugely relevant what you say, and I'd like to reassure you that it is, hugely live in the Global South, and there's a huge amount of interest and support from Indigenous communities and Global South communities for this law. There's not, I know for a fact, there's certainly no intention to misrepresent or not represent adequately right here in this space, but I would just like to reassure you that there are many, many voices from many different parts of the Global South that are speaking out about this.
And the second part is not technically about agroecological farming, which this panel is about, but is about how this, you tell me, can this enable lawyers to use this law to stop, thwart, recompense some of the practices that we've heard about? Yeah. That is a really interesting point, because one of the things that is happening now is that in this so-called transition phase, what's actually happening is we're doubling down on extraction. We're doing both. So, so there's fossil fuel extraction and there's, CRM, what they're called, the rare minerals or whatever. So yes, and there are projects that are being worked on to try and address this in terms of, if and where certain types of mining should be taking place, because of course actually there's a strong correlation between the most fragile ecosystems and the most resource rich areas, and sometimes the most difficult political areas as well. So it's a very real question, and one that is not actually being ignored, but it's not perhaps being tackled nearly as openly as it should be. So I think bringing up is really important. But yeah, there are some broader questions there around lifestyle and stuff as well. I think we've got time, I'm afraid, for kind of one or two more questions. Can we get a mic to this gentleman over here, and then we'll come over here?
Thank you, all of you, and thank the gentleman for his last question as well. Sorry, I'll speak a bit close to the mic. I should have learnt by now. Going back to, I wanted to try and be funny and, Sarah, address you as my lady or my lord or whatever, because I question or challenge your statement that climate change is down to the burning of fossil fuels. I'm not a climate denier, I assure you. What I'm trying to say, it's a much bigger picture than that, and it is very much the destruction of natural systems on the planet. in ways that sometimes can be translated into carbon emissions, but in sometimes they have direct effects. So devastation of the rainforest is directly having an effect on warming the planet. I won't go on. If anybody wants me to back any of this up, get in touch with me or find me. Right, so come back to the actual definition. Unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge, I can't remember things, sorry, that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. A lot of people are now talking, what do we mean by environment? Well, it's a huge ranging thing. So I would want to add in a sub, in brackets, or however it's done technically correctly, ecological function. Anything that damages ecological function. Because then an awful lot of the things that this gentleman was saying would start to get included once people, because the science is pushing us, or no, science is helping us pushing, intelligent thought can do it the same, sorry. It's really important that people take a much broader view on emissions and things, but ecocide is the destruction of the ecosystems, the ecology. And that has got to be the focus, and that will then start including the big picture. Sorry, if that wasn't so much a question.
No,
but
it wasn't. Does anyone have a question? Over here, please. Just here at the front, please.
So I went to the DEFRA talk yesterday about elms and SFI, which was very interesting, although I'm not convinced entirely. And I was just wondering how this law would interact with further agricultural policy in terms of big agrochemical companies and supporting farmers over the transition period. With obviously farming is quite not unstable, but well, I suppose it can be quite economically challenging industry as it is, in addition to like new entrant farmers as well, such as myself. And how do we ensure this system change while ensuring that everyone is okay, if that makes sense? Like everyone's supported and mentally and financially and sustainably as well. So yeah.
That's a big question. Martin, maybe I can get you to answer it. And there's been a few references to economic levers. You've talked about levers. And there is great instability and uncertainty and worry in the farming community about a transition. So can you think of any economic or other levers that would help create the stability that the questioner has asked for?
I think one of the fundamental problems we have with agriculture is profitability. While we look at all the noise around the outside, how are we helping farmers be profitable and get true value for the stuff they produce, whether that's food or the environment and other thing, and get that thing. So having a law on that actually can underpin that if something's harmful and the farmer's doing this, represent something to stop that. And I think farming agroecologically and nature friendly, that it goes, you actually work with nature and enhance it. And if we're putting, as many have, lots of artificial fertilizers, pesticides, if we're putting lots of fungicides on, you're not doing your soil biology a lot of good. So we can start looking at a lot of the products we look in the industry, in an industrialised farming system, that are extracting lots of money out of farmers' pockets and giving us very little reward sometimes. And then the products we sell are getting reduced, low price. So I think it could actually help, and I hope DEFRA look at how we make a profitable system, using public money supporting the right things, but also using private finance and supply chain, paying fair costs for all of the goods and services we get from our landscape. We get food, but we're also doing a lot of else, and the supply chain wants some of that goods from us as well, but they're going to have to pay towards it and contribute towards us delivering their outcomes as well. So I do hope it does unlock potential within the challenges and changes we've got coming at us. Hopefully more young people get opportunities to come into business and be involved in businesses and drive businesses forward. And how do we get more young people to get access to land and bits and pieces? As a farmer, I'm getting paid to do environmental pieces, and on some bits, it's quite a big bit of field. So why can't I allow that bit of field for somebody else to start a business on, and horticulture and bits and pieces? I think we really need to reimagine what we do. So the levers have got to be some public finance, because, and if you look at the figures, it needs doubling the budget, realistically, where that's not going to happen. But also we need to make sure the supply chain are paying for their true cost of production and the impact that has on our landscape and our businesses. So I think it's using those levers, and we need to talk about, and the procurement, government procurement, we can use, if they define what they mean by good food, that will start stimulating the marketplace that we'll be produced into, and will change the marketplace and everything else we produce.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question before I'm going to ask our panellists to wrap up a bit, just about the relationship between Ecocide and agroecology. Hand in the middle at the back, please. That's the lady with the fringe, thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, not knowing much about legal systems, if this law came into practice, how far back could it be applied? Would it just be for current environmental harms, or could it be applied historically?
Is it going to be retrospective, Jojo?
No, that's just not how law works. I mean, otherwise we could have a dictator come in tomorrow and say that anyone that's ever blown their nose with their left hand is a criminal. I mean, you can't just backdate stuff like that. And actually, one of the important things about this, and this is actually a really important point, so thank you very much for bringing it up, because for all sectors, seeing this coming is the really important part. Because the strategic window for change is actually between when you hear about it and when it comes into play. If Ecocide law came into place tomorrow all over the world, the court systems would all just, politicians wouldn't know where to put themselves, court systems would all collapse. It's not about that. It's about changing behaviour. And if you're going to change behaviour, people need to see, further down the line, this is going to be coming in. So my compliance window, the questions I need to be asking between now and, we don't know exactly when it is, but sometime in the next few years. So it stimulates that, the change of direction. I mean, what we're ultimately trying to do isn't throw lots of people in jail, it's protect life.
Thank you. Maybe I'm sure that we'll loiter around afterwards if anyone else has some burning questions. Sorry for throwing you under the bus on that one.
That's fine.
Can I just ask you all maybe just to give a very brief summary, having listened to some of the questions, having heard the debate or people's views about how this might interact, whether or not you think, what you think about this potential law and its direct relationship to this transition to agroecology. Rob, can I start with you just to sum it up?
Yeah, certainly. So I think for me, as I said in the opening, the most immediate value in this is the shift in values that it represents. As an agroecology movement, we're working with actors across the global south. We're thinking about the shift in our relationship with each other as well as the way we eat, the power balance in the system. It's not a sort of mega industrial green transition that I hear talked about here at Oxford Real Farming Conference. I think there's a whole spectrum of transitions probably being envisaged, but a lot of them are not that industrial green transition. And I think the value of the Ecocide concept lies in the intrinsic worth that it recognizes in nature. This idea that we're not just pursuing carbon credits and a green transition for cheaper energy, but because nature is of value in itself, which I think has some resonance, which could be unpicked much more, I think, with the values that underpin the agroecology movement. So I look forward to seeing the practical application of the law, but in the meantime, as an idea, as a concept, I find it very inspiring.
Thank you very much. Martin.
And I'll follow on with that then. I think having the opportunity and today's discussion is raising the awareness, opening it up. How are we going to communicate that? What is it? Any good law shouldn't need using much if it's written well and there. It is there to stop things happening, not that you want to go and get things done. So I think it's the opportunity of the discussion, the openness, what does it mean, the questions that go in, so we can actually help people be informed and actually keep a focus on the harm we have been doing, we might do in the future to nature, and how do we restore it, and then we put the spotlights on hopefully stopping some of that bad practice happening by having a law that sits there ready to be able to be used if it's needed, but the idea is that it shouldn't be needed because we should stop the bad actions happening before they get too bad.
Thank you. Jojo, a summary.
Wow. I mean, my sense is that this this sector, the farming sector and agroecology, you know, this is the sector that interacts directly with the land. And so it feels to me that there is a really sort of direct relevance of a law to protect the everything that gives us what we are as people and gives us life. It should be protected, and that's what criminal law's for. So I do see a really strong relationship there. As I say, it's not a panacea to fix everything, but there's something I can't see how we go forward to support and to thrive in a complex life system on this planet without a basic rule like this in place. So, as I say, necessary, but not sufficient.
Thank you. I want to finish by thanking all the panellists warmly for their extraordinary contributions, because this is a radical idea. Maybe less radical in the last 12 months than it was 5 years ago. And when I was thinking how to sort of summarize that, I basically am going to steal a story that Ian Laurie, who's the judge that I told you about at the beginning of this, told me. When Polly, his wife, was feeling like she was set on an impossible task, that no one would listen to her, and was extremely low, and they were on holiday in Germany, and he took her to a church without telling her what for, and walked into this church in Germany and said to her, "You sit there." And then he walked around to the balcony and sat up at the top. And Polly apparently called up, "Why am I here?" And Ian said, "You are sitting where Luther sat." And what he was looking at up here was the Pope, the Emperor, the whole of the church, dressed in robes, telling him that his audacious task of translating or making the Bible accessible and readable to the average man, rather than being gate-kept from them by the church, was heresy. And it was his trial, and he refused, despite the enormous pressure, despite standing alone in the base of the church, faced with this power and authority and dogma. He refused to recant and was declared a heretic. And in hiding, translated the Bible and went from door to door, nailing it on people's doors, and therefore changed the course of history. And he said this: "Christ is found not in the bones of saints, but in your love for each other," which shows, I suppose, that an individual and a collective can change not just the law, but the course of history. And that when we are beleaguered by the overwhelming task ahead of us, it is worth remembering that there are example after example of that being done before, and that we must not give up. He also said this as a final sign-off, which I think is possibly one that we all need. "Whenever the devil harasses you, seek out the company of friends, drink more, joke, and make merry." And I think in this particular surrounding, we can all say amen to that. Thank you very much.